The dawn broke gray and heavy, a reluctant light spilling across the valley, as though the sun itself no longer had the strength to rise. Mist clung to the soil like a shroud, weaving through the skeletal branches of bare trees and the broken fences that marked the edge of Thomas's farm. He stood on his porch with a hand wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee, staring at the fields that had once brimmed with golden wheat. Now they lay barren, furrows hardened into scars of cracked earth, silent testaments to seasons of disappointment. His boots were coated in yesterday's mud, and his shoulders sagged with the weight of debts that no harvest could cover. He was a man who had lost much, though he seldom spoke of it, his wife, his health, and the farm's once booming fortune, all gone like dust carried by the wind. The wagon leaned crookedly by the barn, a tired relic whose wheels squealed with every turn. It was filled with the last of his goods, sacks of feed, bundles of hay, a few crates of potatoes, meant for the distant market. If he could not sell them, the winter would be merciless. Yet his team of old maras no longer had the strength to pull such a burden. They coughed and staggered even under light harness, their bones too brittle for the road. Thomas rubbed his jaw, his gaze fixed on them with a sadness that cut deep. He loved those animals, but love could not make them strong. Without a horse to pull the wagon, the farm's last chance was slipping away. That morning, with resolve hardened by desperation, he set out for the abandoned auction yard on the outskirts of town. The place had fallen into ruin, its wooden posts splintered, its gates hanging loose on rusted hinges. The smell of hay and sweat had long vanished, replaced by the hollow silence of forgotten things. Yet sometimes, traders left unwanted animals there, creatures too broken, too scarred, or too dangerous for ordinary hands. Thomas walked slowly between the empty stalls, his boots echoing on the dirt floor. Then he saw it. In the far corner, a shadow moved. It was not like the others. The creature that stepped into the dim light seemed carved from the earth itself, towering above any horse Thomas had ever seen. Its coat, though dulled by neglect, bore the deep black sheen of rain-soaked stone. Its muscles rippled beneath the skin, corded and immense, and its mane fell raggedly across eyes that glimmered with something unspoken, pain, perhaps, or defiance. Scars crisscrossed its flank like lightning strikes etched into flesh. The horse stood still, unmoving, its hooves sunk slightly into the dirt, as if the weight of its body alone pressed the earth down. Thomas's breath caught. He had seen strong horses, proud stallions bred for pulling plows and wagons, but nothing like this. This was a giant, a beast forged for burdens beyond imagining. Yet no one had claimed him. No rope bound his neck. No hand reached for his reins. The auction had ended long ago, and still the horse remained. A paper hung from the stall door, curling at the corners. It bore a single word written in haste, unwanted. He stepped closer, his heart heavy. The horse's ears flicked back, eyes narrowing with warning. Thomas froze, raising both hands slowly in the air. "Easy, boy," he murmured, his voice low and steady. "I mean no harm." The horse exhaled sharply, a sound like a warning growl. For a moment they stood locked in silence, man and beast, neither willing to yield. Then Thomas reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crust of bread he had saved from breakfast. He broke it in half and extended his hand. The horse's nostrils flared, though it did not move forward. It simply stared, unblinking, as though weighing the man's soul. No trader, no neighbor, no villager had wanted such a beast. Too wild, too scarred, too unpredictable. Yet Thomas felt something stir within him, a quiet echo of his own heartache reflected in the animal's eyes. Perhaps it was foolishness, perhaps desperation, but he could not walk away. He paid the small coin asked by the caretaker, a mere token for what others saw as worthless, and led the horse home with a rope so thin it seemed laughable against the animal's strength. The horse followed, though every step carried the resistance of mistrust. Back at the farm, the struggle began. The horse refused to enter the barn, planting its hooves in the soil and lowering its head with stubborn fury. Thomas did not strike him, did not shout, though the temptation burned. Instead, he set a bucket of water nearby and scattered hay within reach. "You'll come when you're ready," he said softly, and walked away. For days, He repeated the ritual. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were gentle. Stories of the land, fragments of memories, confessions whispered to the night air. The horse listened, or seemed to, though his eyes always stayed distant. On the fourth evening, Thomas found him inside the barn, standing quietly near the trough. He allowed the man's presence, though not his touch. Progress was measured not in leaps, but in inches. Thomas was patient. He knew trust was not given. It was earned, carved from time and kindness. The farm's days grew shorter. Winter pressed closer. The wagon still sat waiting, heavier with every passing sunrise. One morning, Thomas approached the giant with halter in hand. The horse stamped the ground, ears pinned back, but Thomas's voice was steady. "I need you," he whispered, the words trembling with vulnerability. After a long moment, the horse lowered his head. Harnessing him was no small task. The leather straps strained against his massive frame, and the wagon groaned under the weight it carried. Thomas worked quickly, his breath visible in the cold air. The horse stood tense, muscles taut like bowstrings. For a heartbeat, silence wrapped the farm. Then the man gave a single nod. The wagon creaked as the horse leaned into the weight. His hooves dug deep into the mud, earth splitting beneath the force. The wooden frame rattled, the wheels shuddered, and for a moment Thomas feared the beast would break free in fury. But then, slowly, impossibly, the wagon began to move. Inch by inch, the giant pulled forward, dragging the burden with a strength that seemed carved from legend. The earth trembled with each step, the sound of straining wood and grinding wheels filling the air. Thomas watched, awe and sorrow clashing within him. This was no ordinary horse. This was a creature carrying not only the wagon's weight, but something unseen, something buried deep within. His head hung low, eyes shadowed with grief, as though every step tore open an old wound. And yet he moved, unyielding, unstoppable. Thomas's throat tightened. He whispered the words without thinking, carried by instinct rather than thought. "What have you endured, old friend?" The horse gave no answer, only pressed forward, dragging the wagon into the misty horizon. And for the first time in years, Thomas felt the fragile stirrings of hope, tangled in mystery, urging him to follow. The morning mist lifted slowly, curling away from the valley as if reluctant to reveal what lay beneath. Thomas tightened the harness on the great horse, his fingers trembling slightly with both effort and anticipation. The wagon sat behind them, loaded heavier than before, its wheels caked with layers of hardened mud. He studied the animal, Titan, as he had begun to call him in his heart, though the name was never spoken aloud. The giant's flanks twitched with restrained power, his breath fogging in steady, controlled bursts. There was a quiet solemnity in the way he carried himself, a dignity that both awed and unsettled Thomas. This was not merely a beast of burden. This was something else entirely. When Titan leaned into the weight, the wagon lurched forward, nearly toppling Thomas where he stood. He stumbled, caught himself, and hurried alongside. Each step shook the ground, the horse's hooves pounding like distant thunder. The wagon rattled, creaked, and groaned, but still it moved. Villagers along the road stopped to stare. They had seen Thomas before, a farmer worn thin by misfortune, his wagon dragged weakly by half-starved Morris. But this was different. Now a colossal horse pulled the load with a grim determination that silenced the crowd. "Where did you find that monster?" One man whispered to his wife. Another shook his head, muttering, "No ordinary horse, that one. No good comes from such creatures." Thomas heard the words, but he kept his eyes fixed on the road. He had no answer to give, for he did not understand it himself. All he knew was that without Titan, the wagon would never have moved. And yet, as he watched the horse strain, he felt a pang of unease. The power was immense, but so was the sorrow etched into Titan's every motion. By midday, sweat darkened the horse's coat, shining against the lattice of scars that marred his body. Thomas halted by a stream, letting Titan drink while he knelt on the bank. He washed his face, the cool water easing the burn of exhaustion. When he looked up, Titan's eyes were upon him, unblinking, sharp as flint. For a fleeting second, Thomas felt as though the horse were not merely watching but measuring him, searching for some hidden truth within his soul. "You've carried burdens long before mine," Thomas murmured, his voice barely louder than the stream's murmur. Titan flicked an ear, but did not look away. There was something haunted in that gaze, a memory too heavy to name. That night, after the goods had been sold at market and the wagon sat lighter, Thomas found himself lingering by the barn fire. The stars hung like scattered lanterns above, the kind his wife had once adored. He cradled a tin cup of tea in his hands, staring into the flames, words tumbling from him unbidden. "You'd have liked her," he told Titan, who stood near the fence, eyes glowing in the firelight. "She was patient in a way I never was. She believed every living creature carried a story, even the ones scarred and silent. She said if you listened closely enough, they'd tell you what they needed." His voice cracked, but he forced a smile. "I never listened well. Maybe I'm trying now." The horse shifted, hooves pressing into the dirt, ears angled forward. He made no sound, yet Thomas felt strangely heard, as though the silence itself held compassion. Days turned into weeks. Each journey to market revealed Titan's unmatched strength, but also his unrest. At times he would halt in the middle of the road, muscles rigid, eyes locked on some unseen memory. No whip nor rope could force him forward. Only Thomas's steady voice could coax him back to motion. Each pause carried the weight of a ghost no one else could see. One afternoon, while loading supplies, Thomas overheard two traders speaking near the stalls. Their words snagged his attention. "That black giant. I remember him," one said, shaking his head. "Belonged to a man out west, cruel one. Worked the beast near to death. Loaded him beyond reason." The other spat into the dirt. "I heard the wagon overturned one winter night. Killed the man outright. Some say the horse dragged the wreck for miles. Wouldn't leave it. Not even when the body was taken away. Just stood guard, as if waiting for orders that would never come." The first man lowered his voice. "They tried to sell him after, but no one dared keep him. Too wild, too broken. He's haunted, that one." Thomas stiffened, the words etching themselves into his heart. He turned slowly toward Titan, who stood hitched to the wagon, head bowed as though ashamed. The scars, the silence, the weight in his eyes, it all fell into place. This was no ordinary sorrow. This was grief woven into flesh. The road home was quiet. Thomas walked beside Titan, the leather reins loose in his hands. He wanted to speak, to offer comfort, but no word seemed worthy. What comfort could a man give to a creature who had carried death on his back? Halfway through the valley, Titan stopped. His massive frame trembled, breath-heaving. His eyes fixed on the horizon, pupils wide with fear. Thomas followed the gaze, but saw only fields and shadow. Still, the horse refused to move. "Easy, boy," Thomas whispered, placing a hand on the trembling flank. The skin twitched beneath his touch. "Whatever it is, it can't hurt you now." His voice shook despite the reassurance. He knew the truth. Pain that deep never truly vanished. It only waited, lurking in silence, ready to surface when least expected. After long minutes, Titan stepped forward again, though his head hung lower, his stride heavier. Thomas walked beside him, heart tight. He understood more than he wished. He, too, had ghosts that stopped him in his tracks, moments when memories clutched his chest until breathing was a battle. Perhaps that was why he could not abandon the horse, no matter the whispers, no matter the fear. When they reached the farm, night had already settled. The lantern's glow stretched shadows across the yard, casting Titan's silhouette long and dark against the barn wall. Thomas unhitched him slowly, patting his side though the gesture went unanswered. He watched the giant step into the barn, pausing only once to glance back at him with eyes so hollow and ancient they seemed to carry centuries of sorrow. Thomas swallowed hard. He had wanted strength, a beast to save his farm. What he had found was something else entirely. A creature bound not by rope or harness, but by grief too vast for words. And as he closed the barn doors, he knew the true challenge had only just begun. The wind carried the bite of approaching winter, sharp and unrelenting. Frost clung to the edges of the fields, painting the dead stalks silver. Each morning, Thomas rose before the sun, his body stiff with aches, his breath fogging the chilled air. Titan stood waiting in the barn, a massive shadow that filled the space with quiet presence. The horse had grown accustomed to the man's routines, no longer shying from his approach, though the trust was fragile, like thin glass. One wrong move could shatter it. Patience had become Thomas's only weapon. Each day, he worked with Titan in small steps, speaking softly, offering food by hand, brushing his mane with slow, deliberate strokes. At first, the horse flinched from every touch, his muscles twitching beneath the bristles. But gradually, the resistance gave way. One morning, as Thomas ran the brush along his flank, Titan stilled. The brush revealed not just the sheen of his coat, but also the map of scars etched deep into his skin, long, pale ridges, where leather had cut, where ropes had burned. Thomas's throat tightened, yet he kept his voice calm. "You've carried more than your share," he murmured, resting a hand on the giant's shoulder. For the first time, Titan lowered his head against the man's chest, a gesture heavy with surrender, with trust long denied. Thomas closed his eyes, letting the moment settle into his bones. He knew now that this was no simple beast to be worked, but a companion whose strength came tangled with sorrow. Days bled together as they learned each other's rhythms. Titan followed Thomas willingly to the fields, dragging plows that had once defeated weaker horses. He moved with unmatched force, yet never violently, never without control. The villagers who once whispered now watched in awe, though suspicion lingered in their glances. To them, Titan was both miracle and omen. To Thomas, he was a lifeline, a reminder that broken things could still hold power. It was during one of these ordinary days that disaster struck. A storm rolled in from the mountains without warning, black clouds swallowing the sky. The wind howled, tearing shingles from rooftops and rattling barn doors. Rain lashed the valley in torrents, flooding ditches, turning roads into rivers of mud. Thomas rushed to secure the animals, his coat plastered against his skin, but the sound of shouting carried through the chaos. He turned toward the village and saw smoke, orange flames twisting against the darkness. The old barn near the square had collapsed under the storm's assault. Cries echoed, frantic voices calling for help. A child was trapped inside. Thomas's heart lurched. Without thinking, he seized Titan's reins. The giant balked at the storm, eyes rolling white, but Thomas's voice cut through the roar. "Come with me. They need us." Together they charged into the village, mud splashing beneath hooves that thundered like drums of war. The scene was chaos, villagers pulling at beams, smoke stinging their eyes, the storm driving rain against their backs. But the wreckage was too heavy, too solid. Despair flickered in their faces as the child's cries weakened. Thomas forced his way forward, Titan looming behind him like a shadow of salvation. "Clear the way," he shouted. "Let him through." The crowd parted reluctantly, fear etched in their eyes at the sight of the black giant. But when Thomas hitched the reins to the fallen beams, hope sparked anew. "Easy, boy," he whispered, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his chest. Titan braced himself, muscles rippling, hooves sinking deep into the sodden earth. With a guttural snort, he leaned into the harness. The rope strained, wood groaned. The wreckage shifted but held fast. The villagers gasped. Titan strained harder, his body quaking with effort. Scars along his flanks stretched taut, as though history itself weighed upon him. Then, with a sound like thunder splitting the sky, the beams gave way. The wreckage slid aside, opening a narrow path. Hands rushed in, pulling the child free. A cry rose above the storm. The child was alive. Relief swept the crowd, cheers mingling with sobs. Titan stood trembling, sides heaving, eyes wide with something more than exertion. For a heartbeat, Thomas feared the past had broken through, that the horse would bolt into the night. Instead, Titan turned his head toward him, eyes meeting his with raw intensity. "You're not broken," Thomas whispered, barely audible over the storm. "Not anymore." The villagers gathered, staring in disbelief. Awe replaced suspicion, though whispers still clung to their lips. Some called it a miracle, others a curse turned blessing. Thomas ignored them all. His hand rested firmly on Titan's neck, grounding them both in the moment. When the storm finally relented, the village bore scars of its own. Fallen trees, shattered fences, homes battered by wind and rain. Yet life stirred. The child clung to his mother, the villagers worked shoulder to shoulder, and Titan stood among them, silent and towering, a creature both feared and revered. That night, back at the farm, Thomas tended to the horse with quiet care. He rubbed him down, checked for injuries, offered oats laced with honey. Titan accepted in silence, though his eyes drifted often to the wagon parked in the corner of the barn. Thomas followed his gaze, unsettled. The wagon had sat unused for weeks, yet Titan seemed drawn to it, as though tethered by invisible chains. When the wind rattled the barn doors, a faint sound echoed from the wagon's depths, a rattle, a clink, the shifting of something hidden beneath tarps and wood. Thomas froze. Titan's ears flicked toward the noise, his body stiffening. The great horse stepped forward, nostrils flaring, eyes dark with memory. "What is it?" Thomas asked softly, though no answer came. He touched the wagon's side, feeling the cold wood beneath his palm. Something was inside, something the horse guarded with a grief so profound it made Thomas's chest ache. The mystery pressed heavily upon him. Titan had saved a life, had proven his strength, but the shadows in his eyes remained. Whatever secret lay hidden in that wagon was the heart of it all, the burden that kept the giant chained to sorrow. Thomas drew a slow breath, his mind turning with questions he dared not voice. The time for answers had not yet come, but he knew it would, and when it did, it would change everything. That night, as the storm clouds drifted away and the stars returned to their watch, Titan stood by the wagon, unmoving, a sentinel guarding his past. Thomas watched from the barn door, a silent promise forming on his lips. He would uncover the truth, not to ease his own curiosity, but to free the horse who had carried more than any creature should. And in that promise, their fates bound tighter, the road ahead shrouded in both hope and sorrow. The days after the storm carried a hush, as though the valley itself was recovering from the violence it had endured. Trees lay toppled, their roots clawing the air. Fences sagged in defeat, and roofs bore the scars of rain and wind. Yet life pushed on. Villagers rebuilt, laughter of children returned to the square, and for Thomas, the farm found a fragile rhythm again. Titan worked beside him, steady and tireless, but never free from the shadows that haunted his gaze. Every evening, Thomas noticed it. The horse lingered near the wagon, eyes fixed upon it as though bound by an invisible tether. Sometimes, when the wind swept across the valley, the faint rattle inside stirred again, a sound that sent Titan's ears flicking and his body stiffening. Thomas tried to ignore it at first, telling himself it was only scraps of forgotten tools or rusted chains. But each night, the weight of that mystery pressed heavier, and Titan's sorrow deepened. One evening, Thomas carried a lantern into the barn, its glow pushing back the shadows. Titan shifted uneasily as the man approached the wagon. His great head swung, eyes flashing with unease, hooves scraping the floor. "Easy," Thomas whispered, steadying his hand on the wooden frame. "If this is what chains you, then we'll face it together." He climbed onto the wagon, the boards groaning beneath his weight. Beneath layers of rotting tarp and mold-stained cloth, his hand struck metal. He pulled free a small chest, its iron hinges rusted, its wood darkened with age. Titan snorted, stamping the ground, his breath coming in heavy bursts. The horse's body trembled as though the chest itself radiated anguish. Thomas lowered it to the floor, kneeling in the lantern's glow. With effort, he pried open the stubborn lid. The hinges shrieked in protest before finally giving way. Inside lay a bundle of objects, letters sealed with wax long broken, faded photographs curled at the edges, a boy's woolen cap, small and threadbare. Beneath it all, a pocket watch glinted faintly, its cover etched with initials nearly worn away. Thomas's breath caught. He reached for the photographs first, holding them carefully. One showed a young boy grinning, his arm looped around Titan's powerful neck. Another revealed the same boy sitting proudly atop the horse, laughter frozen in sepia. The letters, though smudged with age, spoke of affection, scribbled notes about feeding Titan, dreams of racing him across fields, promises of always staying together. It became clear. This chest had belonged to Titan's true companion, a boy whose life had ended the night of the accident. Titan had not guarded an empty wagon all those years. He had been carrying the memory of that boy, protecting what little remained of him with unyielding devotion. Thomas set the items gently back into the chest, tears blurring his vision. He turned to Titan, whose eyes glistened in the lantern light. The horse's chest heaved, his body tense as though bracing for judgment. Slowly, Thomas rose and crossed the barn floor. He placed a hand against Titan's muzzle, his voice breaking as he spoke. "You weren't dragging weight for nothing," he whispered. "You were holding on to him, to love, to the only thing you had left." His throat tightened, words catching. "And you've carried it alone, all this time." Titan leaned into the touch, his massive head pressing against Thomas's chest. For the first time, there was no resistance, no guarded barrier. The grief flowed through him, shared between man and beast. Thomas's tears fell freely, soaking into the horse's mane. In that moment he understood. Titan was not cursed by sorrow, but defined by loyalty so fierce it had nearly broken him. The next day, Thomas gathered the villagers. With Titan standing beside him, he opened the chest before them all. He spoke of the boy, of the accident, of the devotion that had tethered this giant to a past no one had seen. Silence blanketed the crowd, their faces softened with awe and sorrow. The whispers of fear and omen dissolved, replaced by reverence. Titan was no longer a beast to be avoided, but a guardian who had carried love beyond death itself. The seasons turned. Winter came with its biting winds, yet the farm endured. Titan pulled plows through frozen soil, his strength unmatched. Spring followed, painting the valley green, and the earth bloomed again under Thomas's steady hand. With each passing day, man and horse grew inseparable. They were not bound by necessity anymore, but by a bond forged in trust and shared grief. Thomas often found himself sitting by the wagon at dusk, Titan's massive frame beside him. Together, they would watch the sun sink behind the hills, its last light bathing the fields in gold. Sometimes Thomas would place the boy's cap on his knee, his hand resting on the chest, now kept safe in his home. He spoke quietly then, not only to Titan but to the memory of the boy. "He's not forgotten," he would say. "Not while you draw breath. Not while I walk this earth." In Titan's eyes, once hollow with pain, now flickered something new. It was not joy, not in the simple sense, but peace. The burden was no longer his alone to carry. Together, they bore it, and together, they healed. On the anniversary of the storm, the villagers gathered again. They built a small marker near the square, a stone engraved with the boy's name and the image of a horse etched beside it. Titan stood before it, head bowed, the crowd silent in respect. For Thomas, it was a moment of closure, a tribute to the love that had endured through pain. That evening, as lanterns lit the valley and laughter returned to the village, Thomas walked Titan home. The farm no longer felt like a place of despair but of resilience, a sanctuary where broken things found purpose again. He paused at the barn, gazing at the giant horse silhouetted against the fading sky. His voice carried softly, more prayer than speech. "You were never unwanted," he said. "You were waiting for someone to understand." Titan flicked an ear, then pressed his great head against Thomas's shoulder. The gesture said everything words could not. In that touch was trust, forgiveness, and a bond stronger than any chain. And so the story settled into its final truth, not of loss, but of love reclaimed. A man who had once been hollow and a horse who had once been haunted now stood together, not as fragments of their past, but as proof that resilience, trust, and devotion could heal even the deepest scars. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing. I bring true, heartfelt stories every day.